On a cold January night in 1931, in a quiet Liverpool suburb, a man came home from a chess club meeting to find his front and back doors locked from the inside.
When he finally got in, he found his wife lying in the front room. She had been beaten to death with such force that the room looked like a slaughterhouse. There was no murder weapon, no forced entry, no motive anyone could prove. And the man who found her, the only person with a key, the only person who seemingly had the opportunity, would spend the rest of his life as the most famous maybe killer in British legal history. This is the story of the Wallace case. Scotland Yard called it unbeatable. Legal scholars still teach it today, and to this day, nearly a century later, nobody knows for certain who killed Julia Wallace. Let's set the scene. William Herbert Wallace was 52 years old, a quiet, unremarkable insurance agent working for the Prudential. He collected weekly premiums door to door across Liverpool's Anfield district. He was thin, bookish, suffered from a kidney condition, and spent his evenings playing chess at the Liverpool Central Chess Club. His wife Julia was a few years older, refined, musical, a little reserved. Neighbors described the Wallaces as a devoted if unremarkable couple. No scandal, no money troubles worth mentioning, no enemies that anyone could name. By every account, they were the kind of people a murder simply did not happen to, which is exactly what makes what happened next so strange. On the evening of Monday, January 19th, 1931, William Wallace was at the chess club, waiting for his usual opponent. At around 7:15 p.m., a call came through to the club for Mr. Wallace. The caller gave his name as R.M. Qualtrough. He said he wanted to discuss some insurance business, something urgent, and asked Wallace to come to his home address the following evening at 7:30 p.m. sharp. The address given was 25 Menlove Gardens East. Wallace wasn't even at the phone when the call came in. A club official took the message and relayed it to him a few minutes later. Wallace reportedly didn't recognize the name Qualtrough at all. Still, business was business. The next evening, he set out to find this address. There was just one problem. Menlove Gardens East did not exist. On the night of January 20th, William Wallace left his house around 6:45 p.m. and began a long, confusing journey across the Mossley Hill area of Liverpool, asking strangers, tram conductors, and even a policeman for directions to Menlove Gardens East. He found Menlove Gardens North, Menlove Gardens West, Menlove Gardens South. East simply wasn't there. At least half a dozen people later confirmed seeing Wallace that night, wandering, asking for directions, clearly searching for an address that didn't exist. By around 7:45 p.m., having failed to find Qualtrough or his house, Wallace gave up and headed home. He arrived back at his house on Wolverton Street sometime around 8:45 p.m., and that's when things got worse. Wallace later said he tried his front door, locked. He went around to the back, also locked. He returned to the front, and this time the door opened. Inside, the house was dark and silent. He went upstairs first, nothing. Then into the front parlor. There, on the floor in front of the fireplace, lay Julia. She had been struck at least 11 times with a heavy, blunt object, likely an iron bar or pipe, hard enough to fracture her skull in multiple places. Blood had sprayed across the walls, the furniture, even the ceiling. Oddly, her coat had been laid over her, almost like someone had covered her, though investigators couldn't agree on whether that was an act of tenderness or a simple practicality to avoid getting blood on the killer's clothes. A small amount of cash was missing from a cash box upstairs, but Julia's jewelry, easily pawnable, was untouched. Wallace ran to fetch neighbors and the police. On the surface, it looked simple. The husband finds the body. The husband has the only key. The phone call supposedly came from a man no one could trace to an address that didn't exist, and conveniently sent Wallace away from home for the only window of time the murder could have happened in. Police theorized Wallace made the Qualtrough call himself, disguising his voice to build himself an alibi. He'd then have roughly enough time, they argued, to kill his wife before leaving for his wild goose chase, timed perfectly to be seen by witnesses establishing his alibi. The timeline was brutally tight, almost impossibly tight. Wallace would have needed to murder Julia, change out of blood-soaked clothes, hide the murder weapon, clean himself up, and still make his tram on schedule, all within minutes. Despite the thinness of the case, Wallace was arrested, tried, and, in April 1931, found guilty of murder. He was sentenced to death. And then something almost unheard of happened. Wallace appealed. And in May 1931, the Court of Criminal Appeal overturned the conviction, the first time in English legal history a murder conviction was quashed, purely because it was deemed not supported by the evidence. Wallace walked free, but he didn't walk back into a normal life. The public had already decided he was guilty. He was harassed, ostracized, and forced to move house repeatedly as crowds gathered outside whichever home he was living in. His health, already poor, declined rapidly. 2 years later, in February 1933, William Herbert Wallace died, officially of kidney disease, though many believe the stress of those final years played its part. He never confessed, he never wavered from his story, and he took whatever he knew to the grave. So if Wallace didn't do it, who did? The most enduring alternative theory points to a man named Richard Gordon Parry, a young, troubled former colleague of Wallace's at the Prudential, who had recently been let go under suspicious circumstances involving missing money. Parry knew Julia, Parry knew the house, and Parry had a documented history of violence and dishonesty. Decades later, a taxi driver named John Parks claimed Parry came to him the night of the murder, asking him to clean blood out of his car, and that Parry allegedly admitted, offhandedly, that he knew more about the Wallace case than anybody. It's a compelling theory. But like everything else in this case, it's unprovable. To this day, the Wallace case is taught in law schools as a textbook example of reasonable doubt, a case so balanced on a knife's edge that even legal experts can't agree on what really happened. Was William Wallace a master manipulator who orchestrated the perfect alibi? Or was he simply an unlucky, grieving man, victimized twice, once by whoever killed his wife, and once by a justice system that nearly hanged him for it? Nearly a century later, the only people who truly know the answer are long gone.
And Menlove Gardens East, the address that never existed, remains, fittingly, a dead end,